We've now come to the fifth way to be a long-term thinker and a good ancestor, which is the idea of holistic forecasting. Now, I think it's quite difficult to imagine being a long-term thinker without trying to make some predictions about the future. Otherwise, we'd be caught in a reactive short-termism. We need to plan for forest fires. We need to plan for AI risks. But most forecasting has been over quite a short-term period, like looking ahead a few years. And I'm not talking about forecasting in terms of predicting the future like Nostradamus, but having a look at what might be the possibilities coming down our road. But I think of holistic forecasting being about much longer than just a few years, and in fact embracing the rise and fall and the trajectories of whole civilizations. Now, the idea of forecasting has a long history, going back at least to ancient Egyptian priests who would predict the size of the annual Nile flood based on the color of the waters that were coming downstream. But its modern embodiment really goes back to the 1960s, to the idea of what's called scenario planning. This is a kind of forecasting where you try and predict a range of possible outcomes. There might be business as usual outcomes, there might be likely changes, there might be wildcard outcomes. And this started becoming very popular in the 1960s, particularly in US government circles, when they were trying to predict what might happen if there was a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, how many people might die in different situations. And then forecasting took off even more in the 1970s, when it was really captured by the business world, when companies like Shell started doing scenario planning when they were trying to predict what might happen to global oil prices. Where they're going to go very high or very low, will there be shortages or not? And Shell became very good at predicting oil prices. It made them a lot of money. But I think what really happened with forecasting then, scenario planning, it was in a way dominated or hijacked by business interests, by corporate interests, and we need to do more than that. And I think one of the really fascinating things that's happened since the growing knowledge of the climate emergency since the 1990s is that forecasting has been taken out of simply the realm of business, is being used more and more to predict what might happen to our planetary home. So you've got climate scientists, or for example, the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN body charged with this issue, who are now looking at predicting what might happen to temperature rises over the next 50 years, or sea level rises over the next 100 years, even over the next 500 years. I've seen studies of the Netherlands of what it might look like in the year 2300 if the Delta Works flood protection system is breached. Over half of the country will be underwater. And so we're doing more and more of this long-term thinking because of the ecological emergency. But I think we also need to be trying to forecast the rise and fall of whole civilizations, particularly in our age of polycrisis or metacrisis, where we're faced with AI risks and climate risks and political problems linked to migration and threats to democracy. All of these things are threatening the very stability of our civilization itself. And in a sense, the good news is that over the last decade or more, there's been an emerging field looking at the rise and fall of civilizations and predicting what might happen to our civilizational possibilities. And this new kind of scholarly literature goes back at least to the 18th century, to the works of Edward Gibbon, his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, or the writings of the 14th century Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun. Some of the best contemporary researchers include people like Jared Diamond, whose work you may have read. I'm particularly enamored with the work of someone called Luke Kemp at the University of Cambridge. He's done a study, and you can see some of his evidence here, where he's tried to calculate how long ancient civilizations lasted, the Roman Empire, the Assyrians, and so on. And his conclusion is that the average ancient civilization lasts 336 years, which is a pretty precise figure. One might debate this. The point, though, is to recognize that no civilization lasts forever. They rise, they flower, and then they fall. And there's no reason to think that our civilization will last forever. Ours has risen, and ours may well fall. And someone who thought a lot in a very deep way about civilizational dynamics was Jonas Salk, who I mentioned earlier, the person who, at least to me, raised that question of how we can be good ancestors. He became very obsessed in his later life with something that's sometimes called the S curve, or the logistic curve. Imagine a curve in an S shape. And at the bottom of the curve, and this is how he saw civilizations, this is where we are today, a period of kind of growth, where he says our civilization, he calls it epoch A, has been dominated by the values around consumption, excess, independence, and short-range thinking. And he says what we need to do is move from this epoch A, the curve going upwards, onto a more mature curve, balancing out, which he calls epoch B, where the dominant values are things like sustainability, balance, interdependence rather than independence, and long-range thinking rather than short-range thinking. So we've got to jump from epoch A to epoch B. We are still caught in that growth, progress-based mentality of epoch A. I think it's a really great way of thinking about our possible civilizational trajectories. And I think what it at least helps me realize or see, is that most of our dominant institutions today were invented in epoch A over the last few centuries. Things like consumer capitalism, representative democracy. They weren't designed for a world where we're putting more and more pressure on the planet, for example. That's why we need to change everything, really, at the systems level. We need new political systems. We need new economic systems. We will come to all of this. And this is sometimes described as the QWERTY problem. Now, QWERTY, if you look at a normal keyboard, you'll see that our normal keyboards are called QWERTY keyboards, and they were designed in the 19th century for when typewriters used to have mechanical movements, and they were designed so that the most commonly used letters were very far apart, so the mechanical arms wouldn't hit each other. Now, we don't need that design now because we've got computers. We don't have mechanical arms, yet we still have the same keyboard layout as they had in the 19th century. It's crazy, yet we still got it. And this is the same when it comes to our political and economic and many of our cultural institutions. We've got this old-fashioned system which is no longer fit for purpose. We're stuck in epoch A. We need to jump to epoch B. And we can see the danger of our epoch A civilization in this diagram called the Great Acceleration. This depicts the period probably since the 1950s where all of those curves have been going upwards, not just GDP or economic growth, but also carbon emissions, deforestations, water use, ocean acidification, all these kinds of things. All those indicators are going in the wrong direction. They're going in the direction of a civilization that is set to break rather than bend or transform. And when I think about the overall prospects for our own civilization, I think of three pathways that it could take. As you can see in this diagram here, one of those pathways is the red one, breakdown, where we continue with business as usual. We don't adjust to the ecological problems that we've got and other challenges that we face, and our civilization goes into a state of collapse. The second route we might face is, I call reform, where we start tinkering with a system. We adjust tax rates. Maybe we tax carbon a little bit more. We introduce a few more sustainability possibilities. But really, this just keeps our current trajectory going for a little while, and then we're likely to crash or break down again. And the third pathway is what I call transformation. This is where we jump onto an epoch B pathway with deeply sustainable values, with long-term thinking. And our possibilities for jumping onto the transformative pathway are conditioned by the light blue line in the middle, disruptions. These could be disruptions in new technologies like carbon capture and storage, or crises like mass climate disasters. These will impact on the pathway that we are going to go on. So the question really then is, how do we jump onto a transformative civilizational pathway? How do we move from epoch A to epoch B? How do we get off that breakdown curve? And that's what we're going to turn to next.